My daughter was left to freeze outside while her husband feasted indoors. It was 11:37 p.m. on December 15th when I discovered them. The digital thermometer on my dashboard read minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill that made it feel like the surface of Mars. I was pulling into my driveway after a brutal 16-hour double shift at Ford when I heard it. The desperate wailing of a baby cutting through the Michigan winter wind like a knife through silence. Not the comfortable crying of a child safely indoors, but the raw, terrified screaming that means someone is dying. My headlights swept across the Morrison house next door, and there they were. My 26-year-old daughter, Jessie, huddled against their front door like a refugee seeking sanctuary. In her arms, my 18-month-old granddaughter, Emma, both of them shaking so violently I could see it from 50 feet away. But here's what made my blood turn to ice. Through the warm, glowing dining room windows, I could see K.O. Morrison, my son-in-law, sitting alone at a table set for one. Candlelit dinner, prime rib, wine, classical music drifting across the frozen yard. He was cutting his steak with the casual precision of a man celebrating something special, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife and daughter were slowly freezing to death 20 feet from his warm, comfortable meal. I was out of my truck before the engine stopped running. "Jessie? Jesus Christ, what are you doing out here?" She looked up, and her face in my headlights told me everything I needed to know about what kind of man my daughter had married. Fresh bruises, split lip, eyes hollow with the kind of shock that comes from discovering the world isn't safe. Emma's tiny fingers were blue, clutching a blanket that was already stiff with ice. "Dad," Jessie whispered through chattering teeth, "he locked us out." I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen. Through the window, K.O. raised his wine glass in what looked like a private toast. To what, I couldn't imagine, but I was about to find out. And before this night was over, I was going to make sure it never happened again. My name is Grand Rapids. Yes, like the city, a family naming tradition that goes back 4 generations. I served 30 years in the United States Army, enlisting straight out of high school in 1988 and retiring as a master sergeant in 2018. My service included 2 deployments to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan, and more peacekeeping missions in places most Americans couldn't find on a map than I care to remember. For the past 7 years, I've supervised the night shift quality control operation at Ford's Grand Rapids assembly plant, where we build the Ford Explorer and Lincoln Aviator. I know the rules, I know procedures. I know how to collect evidence, maintain chain of custody, and document everything in a way that will hold up under hostile scrutiny. More importantly, after 3 decades of dealing with personnel problems, supply chain issues, and the occasional genuine security threat, I know what it looks like when someone is running a long con. And my son-in-law was definitely running some kind of con. I carried Emma inside my house first, her little body so cold it scared me more than incoming artillery ever had. The sudden warmth of my living room made her cry again, which was actually a relief. It meant her body was still trying to regulate its temperature. Jessie followed us inside, moving with the careful, controlled steps of someone who'd learned to make herself as small and non-threatening as possible. "I need to make some calls," I told Jessie as I settled her on my couch with a heated blanket and cranked the thermostat up to 80 degrees, starting with a lawyer. On her hand shot out to grab my wrist. "Dad, no, please, it's not that bad. We just had a fight about money and things got a little heated. He didn't mean for us to be out there that long. He probably fell asleep or—" "Jessie." I kept my voice level and controlled, using the tone I'd developed over years of dealing with panicked subordinates in crisis situations. "Look at me, honey." She met my eyes reluctantly. Men who love their families don't lock them outside in sub-zero weather. Men who love their families don't have candlelit dinners while their wife and baby freeze. Men who love their families don't create situations where their children end up with hypothermia because of their anger. I watched her process this information, watched her face cycle through denial, rationalization, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance that broke my heart. "I should have seen this coming," she whispered. No, you shouldn't have. You're not supposed to have to protect yourself from your husband. That's not how marriage is supposed to work. At 11:58 p.m., I dialed Martha Chen Williams' personal cell phone. Martha had been my late wife's college roommate and maid of honor at our wedding 27 years ago. After Sarah died 3 years ago from ovarian cancer, Martha had helped me navigate the legal complexities of estate planning and grief counseling resources. She was also one of the most respected family law attorneys in Western Michigan, with a particular expertise in domestic violence cases. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. "Grand, what's wrong?" "I need an emergency protective order filed first thing Monday morning. Tonight, if there's any possible way to make it happen." There was a pause while she processed the implications of an emergency legal call from a man who'd never asked for help with anything in the 12 years she'd known me. "How bad are we talking here?" I looked at Jesse, who was holding Emma close while they both warmed up under blankets, both of them finally showing signs of normal color, returning to their skin. "Bad enough that my daughter and granddaughter are sleeping here tonight, and they're not going back to that house until I know they'll be safe. I can file emergency papers with the duty judge, but I'll need documentation. Photos, medical records, police reports if you have them." "I'll have photos within the hour. Medical records by tomorrow afternoon." "Good. And Grand, start documenting everything right now. Timestamps, temperatures, witnesses, phone calls, everything. The more detailed your records, the stronger our case." "Already on it. One more thing. Be careful. If this is as serious as it sounds, and if he's got resources, things could get complicated quickly." I hung up and turned to look at Jessie. "We're going to the emergency room. Now." She started to shake her head. "Dad, I'm fine. We're both fine now. I just need to—" "This isn't up for debate, honey. We need official medical documentation of what happened tonight. Not for revenge, not to punish anyone, but to protect you and Emma if this ever happens again." And deep in my gut, I was already certain that without intervention, it would happen again. The drive to Mercy General Hospital took us through empty streets, slick with black ice, and lined with the kind of deep snow that makes experienced Michigan drivers nervous. Emma had fallen asleep in her car seat, finally warm enough to rest. Jessie stared out the passenger window at the Christmas decorations still hanging on lampposts throughout downtown Grand Rapids, their cheerful red and green lights reflecting off the snow-covered pavement like some kind of mockery of seasonal joy. "When did it start?" I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. Jessie was quiet for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, barely audible above the sound of the heater and the tires crunching through snow, 3 weeks after we got back from the honeymoon. That would have been August, 5 months ago. "What was the first incident?" "He got angry about a credit card bill, said I was spending too much money on groceries, that I was trying to bankrupt him with my expensive tastes." She let out a bitter laugh. "I was buying organic baby food for Emma, $40 worth." I'd noticed changes in Jessie over the past few months, but I'd attributed them to the normal adjustments that come with marriage and new motherhood. My daughter, who'd called me every Sunday without fail for 8 years, who used to stop by after work just to talk about her day, who'd always been the first person to volunteer for family gatherings, had become distant. Polite when we spoke, but distant. When I'd asked her about it directly, she'd had explanations that seemed reasonable at the time. She was tired from taking care of Emma. She was busy adjusting to married life. She needed space to figure out her new identity as a wife and mother. Now I understood those explanations for what they really were. The carefully crafted responses of someone who'd been coached on how to deflect concern from people who might interfere with her husband's control. "The money problems he talks about," I said carefully. "Are they real?" Another long pause, this one filled with the kind of uncertainty that comes from having someone else control access to information about your own life. "I don't know anymore. He handles all the finances. Says it's more efficient that way since he works in sales and understands numbers better than I do." Red flag number 2. Financial control almost always preceded physical escalation in domestic abuse situations. I'd learned that during the mandatory awareness training the Army had started requiring for all NCOs in the late 1990s. Does he let you see the bank statements? He shows me summaries, says the detailed stuff would just confuse me and make me worry unnecessarily. Red flag number 3. We pulled into the hospital parking lot, which had been plowed, but was already accumulating a fresh layer of snow. The emergency entrance blazed with fluorescent light that seemed harsh and institutional after the warm glow of Christmas decorations downtown. I could smell antiseptic and floor wax even through the closed windows of my truck. Here's what's going to happen, I told her as I turned off the engine. We're going to document every injury, no matter how minor. We're going to get official medical records with proper timestamps and chain of custody. We're going to make sure that if we ever need to prove what happened tonight, we'll have evidence that will hold up in court. Dad, I don't want to send him to jail. I just want him to get help. I want us to get help. I know you do, honey, and maybe that's possible, but right now we need to protect you and Emma. Everything else is secondary. The automatic doors of the emergency entrance slid open as we approached, and the blast of heated air carried the familiar sounds of a busy trauma center, beeping monitors, quiet conversations between medical staff, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on polished floors. Dr. Helen Rodriguez, the attending physician on duty, took one look at Jesse's face and immediately began the process that would change everything. It was 2:47 a.m. when we finally left the hospital. By then, we had official documentation of recent injuries, photographs taken with medical equipment that included timestamps and patient identification numbers, x-rays showing evidence of previous trauma that Jesse had never told me about, and a paper trail that would be admissible in any court in Michigan. The real investigation was just beginning, but I already knew how it was going to end. I just didn't know yet how ugly it was going to get before we reached that ending. Dr. Helen Rodriguez had been documenting domestic violence cases for 15 years, and it showed in the way she approached Jesse's examination. She was thorough without being invasive, professional without being cold, and she knew exactly which questions to ask and how to ask them in a way that would encourage honest answers rather than defensive responses. Jesse, I need you to tell me about this bruising pattern on your upper arm, she said, gently manipulating Jesse's sleeve to reveal finger-shaped marks that were clearly visible even under the harsh fluorescent lights. I fell down the stairs last Tuesday. Ko tried to catch me, but he grabbed my arm too hard. Dr. Rodriguez nodded and made notes on her tablet, but I could see in her expression that she'd heard variations of this story hundreds of times before. These marks here, on your wrist. Can you tell me how those happened? Jesse's voice got smaller. I'm not sure. I bruise easily. And this injury to your lip? I walked into a cabinet door. The examination took 53 minutes. Dr. Rodriguez was methodical, documenting each injury with photographs that included rulers for scale, medical identification cards for reference, and detailed notes about the approximate age of each bruise, based on coloration and healing patterns. She was building a medical record that would tell a story in court, and she was doing it with the kind of professional expertise that came from too much experience with cases like this one. But it was the x-ray that stopped all of us cold. Jesse, Dr. Rodriguez said, clipping the film to a lighted viewing board, this rib here, the fourth rib on your left side, it was fractured approximately 4 months ago. Do you remember that injury? Jessie stared at the x-ray for a long moment, and I watched something shift in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition that she'd been hoping to avoid. I told Ko I fell off a stepladder while I was changing a light bulb in the kitchen. And what did he say when you told him about the fall? He said I was clumsy, that I needed to be more careful around the house, especially with Emma depending on me. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. 4 months ago was August, right after they'd returned from their honeymoon in Mackinac Island. The timing wasn't coincidental. Dr. Rodriguez continued her examination, finding evidence of what she carefully termed repeated minor trauma, consistent with a pattern of physical abuse. Small injuries that individually might be explained away as accidents, but together painted a clear picture of systematic violence that had been escalating over time. Dr. Rodriguez understood the legal implications of proper documentation. Each photograph she took included a medical ruler for accurate measurement, a card showing the date, time, and patient identification number, and her signature as the examining physician. The X-rays were labeled according to hospital protocol and stored in the medical record system with timestamps that would be admissible in court. All documentation was signed, witnessed, and sealed according to legal standards for evidence preservation. These records will be available for subpoena if legal proceedings become necessary, she explained, handing me a sealed envelope containing copies of the complete medical file. I've also filed a mandatory report with Adult Protective Services, as required by Michigan law. I transferred the medical files to the locked briefcase that had served me well during my final years in the Army, when I'd been responsible for sensitive personnel documentation. The originals would remain in the hospital's secure record system, accessible through legal channels, but protected from unauthorized access. Copies would go directly to Martha Chen Williams for inclusion in our legal filing. I made additional digital copies on an encrypted USB drive, which I secured in my home safe along with other important documents. Every piece of evidence needed to have what the military called chain of custody, a documented trail showing who had possession of it at all times, when they had it, and why they had access to it. In the Army, we'd called it covering your six. In civilian legal terms, it was called building a case that would survive hostile cross-examination by expensive defense attorneys. By the time we left Mercy General, the sun was starting to rise over Grand Rapids, painting the fresh snow with shades of pink and gold that made the world look clean and new and full of possibility. But I'd learned long ago not to trust appearances. Beautiful mornings could hide ugly truths, and the real work was just beginning. At 6:15 a.m., as I was helping Jesse and Emma get settled in my guest room, my phone rang. Unknown number, but the caller ID showed a local area code. Is this Grand Rapids? Who wants to know? Someone who thinks you should mind your own business before you get hurt. Then the line went dead before I could respond. I added the call to the log I'd started keeping, noting the exact time, duration, and substance of the conversation. Someone was already watching our movements, which meant they were taking this situation seriously. That made two of us. Back at my house, with Jesse and Emma finally sleeping safely in my guest room for the first time in months, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was stronger than necessary and began planning my next moves. 30 years of military service, including 2 years as an intelligence specialist early in my career, had taught me that information gathering was only as valuable as your ability to protect and preserve that information. The first priority was digital security. I helped Jessie change all her passwords on my personal laptop, a machine that KO had never had access to, and therefore couldn't have compromised with keyloggers or other monitoring software. Email accounts, online banking, social media, credit monitoring services, everything. I watched her hands shake as she typed, muscle memory fighting against years of having someone else control access to her own financial and personal information. He knows all my passwords, she admitted as we worked through her list of online accounts. He said it was so he could help with paying bills and managing our finances, but I think he's been reading my emails. Has he ever mentioned conversations you've had with other people that he shouldn't know about? She nodded slowly. Last month, I was talking to my friend Sarah about maybe taking Emma to visit my cousin in Detroit. I never mentioned it to KO, but that same evening he brought up how he thought it was a bad idea for me to travel without him. Classic surveillance behavior. He was monitoring her communications, which meant he'd known about our hospital visit within hours of our return home. We created entirely new accounts with complex passwords and two-factor authentication. I taught her about private browsing modes, how to clear browser history completely, and how to use encrypted messaging apps that wouldn't leave traces on devices he might have access to. Basic digital hygiene that most people take for granted, but that becomes critically important when someone is monitoring your every electronic move. I made 4 copies of all our evidence, 1 encrypted USB drive in my home safe, one in a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, one with Martha Chen Williams in her office safe, and one in a hidden location that I didn't tell anyone about, including Jesse. An old military saying that had served me well in some very dangerous places: never put all your eggs in one basket, and always have a backup that nobody else knows about. By Wednesday afternoon, I'd used accumulated vacation time to take a week off from the plant. My supervisor wasn't happy about the short notice, but 30 years of perfect attendance and exemplary performance reviews bought me some flexibility when I really needed it. Kayo's daily routine was predictable in the way that most people's routines are predictable. Coffee and newspaper at home until 8:30, arrive at Morrison Auto Group by 9 o'clock, lunch at various restaurants around town depending on whether he was meeting clients or eating alone, back to the dealership until closing time. But Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, he had what he'd told Jesse were extended client meetings that took him away from the office for 2 to 3 hours. I followed him on Tuesday, using surveillance techniques I'd learned during my intelligence training 30 years ago, and refined through years of hunting in Michigan forests, where patience and invisibility were the difference between success and going home empty-handed. Staying 3 cars back in traffic, switching lanes unpredictably, using other vehicles to mask my presence. At 2:15 p.m., he pulled into the parking lot of the Iron Mountain Hotel, a mid-level business hotel near the airport that catered to traveling salespeople and corporate meetings. The woman who met him there was young, maybe 23 or 24, with dark hair and the kind of nervous energy that made her constantly check her surroundings. She kept looking over her shoulder as she walked from her rusted Honda Civic to the hotel entrance, moving like someone who expected trouble and wanted to be ready for it when it arrived. They disappeared into room 217 for exactly 93 minutes. I know because I timed it while sitting in my truck with a thermos of coffee and a clear view of both the hotel entrance and Kayo's BMW. I photographed his license plate in the hotel parking lot. Michigan license 8BG531. I photographed the timestamp on the hotel's electronic sign. 3:42 p.m., 38 degrees, December 18th. I photographed them leaving separately, him through the front entrance looking relaxed and satisfied, her through the side door near the parking garage looking anxious and upset. Thursday afternoon, same pattern, same hotel, same room number, same nervous young woman, same 90-minute time frame. It took me 2 days of careful investigation to identify the young woman. Her name was Amanda Peterson, and she lived in a studio apartment in the college district near Grand Valley State University. She worked part-time at a coffee shop called The Daily Grind, drove a 2008 Honda Civic that probably wouldn't pass its next safety inspection, and according to public records, had no criminal history and no obvious connection to Kayo or his family. On Friday morning, I positioned myself at the Daily Grind during her shift, ostensibly reading the newspaper and drinking coffee while actually observing her interactions with customers and coworkers. She was polite, efficient, and clearly nervous about something that had nothing to do with the normal stresses of food service work. More importantly, when she turned to reach for something on a high shelf and her scarf shifted, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Faint but unmistakable bruise marks around her throat, the kind that come from manual strangulation. This wasn't a simple extramarital affair. This was something much more complicated and much more dangerous. I called Martha from my truck in the coffee shop parking lot. We need to meet. Today. In person. What did you find? More than I was looking for, and it's worse than we thought. Martha's law office occupied the 3rd floor of a restored 19th century building in downtown Grand Rapids, with tall windows that looked out over the Grand River and walls lined with law books that actually got used rather than just displayed for show. She'd been up since 5 a.m. researching Michigan's domestic violence statutes and preparing preliminary legal documents for our case. "Show me everything," she said, clearing space on her conference table for the files I'd brought. Jessie had provided her bank statements, credit card bills, investment account summaries, and insurance documentation going back 18 months. For a couple that supposedly had serious money problems, the Morrisons showed significant assets on paper. Joint checking account with consistent deposits from both their jobs, savings account that had grown steadily until 3 months ago, investment portfolio worth nearly $60,000, and equity in their house that put their net worth well into 6 figures. But when you looked closer at the transaction history, a disturbing pattern emerged. $45,000, I said, pointing to Jesse's individual savings account statements, gone in 6 electronic transfers over 12 weeks. Martha studied the dates and amounts. $7,500 each time. That's exactly $500 below the $10,000 threshold that triggers automatic federal reporting requirements. Someone who knows banking regulations. Someone who knows money laundering regulations. Each transfer had been made to an entity called Eastwood Automotive Services, with memo lines indicating vehicle maintenance and repair services for cars that, according to Jesse, the Morrison family didn't own. Jesse, Martha asked gently, did you authorize these transfers? K.O. said they were investments in his cousin's auto repair business. He handles all our financial planning, so I just signed where he told me to sign. I felt that familiar sensation of pieces clicking together in my mind. Not the satisfying click of a puzzle being solved, but the ominous click of a trap being recognized just before it closes. We need to trace these payments, I told Martha, and we need to do it fast. Eastwood Automotive Services occupied a rundown garage in the industrial district on the south side of town, squeezed between a scrap metal yard and a warehouse that had been empty for so long that homeless people had started using it for shelter. The building itself was a relic from the 1970s, all corrugated metal siding and hand-painted signs that had faded to illegibility. I drove past the place 6 times over 3 days, documenting the patterns of activity and taking photographs from different angles and at different times of day. The business claimed to be an automotive repair shop, but none of the visual indicators supported that claim. 23 vehicles in various states of disrepair filled the lot, but in 18 hours of observation, I never saw mechanics working on any of them. No customers dropping off cars or picking them up, no parts delivery trucks, no signs of the normal activity you'd expect from a legitimate repair operation. But twice daily, always at 10 o'clock a.m. and 6 o'clock p.m., expensive late-model cars would pull up to the building's side entrance. Well-dressed men would get out, go inside for exactly 15 minutes, then leave. The cars were always clean, always luxury models, always driven by people who clearly didn't need budget automotive repairs. On Thursday evening, I positioned myself across the street in an abandoned gas station parking lot with a camera, a thermos of coffee, and the kind of patience that comes from 30 years of military training. At exactly 6:12 p.m., a black Cadillac Escalade with heavily tinted windows pulled up to the building. Michigan plates, current registration sticker, no visible damage or wear that would require repair services. 2 men got out. One wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, the other in casual clothes, but moving with the controlled awareness of someone who'd been trained for violence. They went inside carrying nothing. They came out 14 minutes later carrying a black leather briefcase that hadn't been there when they went in. This wasn't about fixing cars. This was about fixing books, washing money, and turning illegal profits into seemingly legitimate business transactions. And my daughter's college fund was somehow in the middle of it. By the following Monday, word had begun circulating through Grand Rapids that Grand Rapids, the man, not the city, was making serious allegations against the Morrison family. In a community of 48,000 people where everyone knows everyone and family reputations span generations, this was the kind of news that traveled faster than weather reports. Vincent Morrison Sr. wasn't just K.O.'s father, he was one of the most prominent business owners in the Tri-County area. Morrison Auto Group employed 62 people directly and probably supported another 100 jobs indirectly through suppliers, contractors, and service providers. The family had sponsored the Grand Rapids High School football team for 20 years, donated the money for the new children's wing at Mercy General Hospital, and hosted an annual Christmas party for underprivileged kids that had become a community institution. When someone like Vincent Morrison Sr. becomes the subject of negative attention, the entire community feel the ripple effects. I started noticing the changes immediately. At the grocery store, conversations would stop when I walked down an aisle, resuming only after I'd passed. People who'd been friendly neighbors for 7 years suddenly found reasons to go inside their houses whenever I was working in my yard. Bob Hendricks, who lived 2 doors down and had borrowed my snowblower at least a dozen times, crossed the street to avoid walking past my house. At the Ford plant, the shift supervisor pulled me aside during my break. "Grand, I don't know what's going on with your family situation, and I don't want to know. But some people higher up the food chain are asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind where influential community members call other influential community members and wonder if certain employees might be having judgment issues that could affect their work performance." I understood the subtext. Ford Motor Company had relationships with every major business in the Grand Rapids area, including Morrison Auto Group. Vincent Morrison Sr. had the kind of influence that could make life difficult for people who crossed his family, even indirectly. "Are you telling me my job is in danger?" "I'm telling you to be very sure about whatever you're doing, because if you're wrong, it's going to cost you more than you can afford to lose." Saturday morning brought the first piece of anonymous mail, a plain white envelope with my name written in block letters, tucked under my windshield wiper with no postmark or return address. Some people need to learn when to mind their own business before they get hurt. Saturday evening, the first threatening phone call. The voice was electronically disguised, processed through what sounded like a voice changer app. "Grandpa should think about early retirement, maybe somewhere warm and quiet, before there's an accident." Sunday morning, someone had spray-painted "liar" across my garage door in red letters 2 feet tall. Sunday night, a rock the size of a softball came through my living room window, wrapped in a note that said, "Last warning." I documented everything with photographs, timestamps, and police reports. Officer Ray Murphy, who'd served 2 tours in Iraq about 5 years after my own deployments, took the report seriously and assured me that patrol cars would increase their presence in my neighborhood. But we both understood the limitations of what local police could do about anonymous harassment that didn't rise to the level of direct threats against specific persons. "Watch your back, Grand," Murphy said as he finished photographing the broken window. "Whoever's doing this, they're escalating. And escalation usually doesn't stop until someone gets hurt or someone gets arrested." I started carrying my legally registered Sig Sauer P320, the civilian version of the pistol I'd carried during my final years of military service. Michigan's concealed carry laws were straightforward. My permits were current, and I'd maintained my marksmanship qualifications even after retirement. Hopefully, I'd never need to use the weapon, but hope wasn't a tactical plan, and I'd learned long ago that when people start making threats, smart money says they'll eventually try to make good on them. Tuesday morning, I walked across the 20 feet of snow-covered ground between my house and the Morrison house and knocked on their front door. It was time to have a direct conversation with my son-in-law. K.O. answered wearing a bathrobe and the kind of 5 o'clock shadow that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Good. That made 2 of us. "We need to talk," I said. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him, probably because he didn't want our conversation to be overheard by anyone inside the house. The morning air was cold enough to make our breath visible, and I could smell coffee and bacon from inside the house, the comfortable aromas of a normal family breakfast that felt surreal given the circumstances. "Look, Grand, I know you're upset about what happened last Friday night, but marriages have problems. Jesse and I are working through some issues with a counselor, and we don't need family interference making things more complicated." I pulled out a manila folder containing copies of selected documents from our investigation and set it on the porch railing between us. Medical records from Mercy General. Financial statements showing $45,000 in unauthorized transfers. Some very interesting surveillance photographs. The change in his expression was immediate and profound. The concerned husband act disappeared, replaced by something much more calculating and much more dangerous. What exactly are you trying to say? I'm saying that my daughter has had 4 documented injuries since your honeymoon, including a fractured rib that she never mentioned to me. I'm saying that her college fund has been systematically drained through transfers to a business that doesn't appear to actually repair cars. I'm saying that you've been meeting with a young woman at the Iron Mountain Hotel twice a week for the past month. And he was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the kind of intensity that suggested he was calculating options and probabilities. You don't understand the situation you're interfering with, he said finally. Then explain it to me. There are people involved in my business arrangements who don't appreciate outside interference. People who have significant investments in maintaining their privacy. People who have a lot to lose if certain financial relationships become the subject of public scrutiny. I stepped closer, using the height and presence advantages that had served me well during 3 decades of military leadership. Is that a threat? He smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. It's friendly advice from someone who's trying to protect his family. Old man, you have no idea who you're dealing with. I picked up my folder and tucked it back under my arm. You know what? You're absolutely right. I don't know who I'm dealing with yet, but I'm about to find out. As I walked back to my house, I could feel him watching me through the front window. The conversation had accomplished exactly what I'd intended. Now he knew that I was serious, and I knew that whatever he was involved in went far beyond simple domestic violence. The stakes had just gotten much higher. Wednesday night, I followed Keo's money trail to its ultimate destination. After his meeting at Eastwood Automotive, where he'd spent exactly 27 minutes talking to 2 men in expensive suits, he drove across town to the warehouse district on the south side of Grand Rapids. This was an area of empty buildings, abandoned factories, and businesses that operated after hours for customers who preferred privacy. The building he parked outside had no signage, no legitimate business indicators, and windows that had been painted black from the inside. But the parking lot was full of expensive cars, and there was enough foot traffic going in and out to suggest that whatever was happening inside was popular with people who had money to spend. I parked across the street behind a dumpster and settled in for a long surveillance session. The smell that drifted across from the building was unmistakable. Cigarette smoke, spilled alcohol, and the particular combination of desperation and false hope that hangs around illegal gambling operations like cheap cologne. Through a crack in one of the painted windows, I could see enough of the interior to understand what I was looking at. Poker tables, slot machines that had probably been stolen from legitimate casinos, and a sports betting operation running out of what used to be the building's office space. Keo was at one of the poker tables, and from his body language, slumped shoulders, frequent trips to what I assumed was the ATM machine in the corner, increasingly agitated hand gestures, he wasn't winning. I watched him lose what looked like several $1,000s over the course of 3 hours. More importantly, I watched him have an increasingly heated conversation with a man who was clearly in charge of the operation. A man I recognized from old intelligence briefings as Big Tony Castellano. Tony Castellano had been a person of interest in federal investigations of organized crime activities throughout the Midwest for over a decade. He wasn't someone you wanted to owe money to, and he definitely wasn't someone who accepted excuses when payment schedules weren't met. When Keo finally left the building at 1:30 a.m., he looked like a man who just realized he was in much deeper trouble than he could handle. And when I followed him home, I watched him sit in his car in his own driveway for 20 minutes, staring at his house like he was trying to figure out how to explain to his wife that he'd just made their situation much, much worse. Suddenly, everything made sense. The money is missing from Jesse's accounts, the meetings at Eastwood Automotive, the escalating domestic violence, even the affair with Amanda Peterson. K.O. Morrison wasn't just an abusive husband. He was a desperate man who owed dangerous people more money than he could possibly repay through legitimate means, and that made him capable of things that were much worse than domestic violence. Thursday afternoon, my neighbor, Beth Thompson, knocked on my door carrying a covered casserole dish that smelled like comfort food and a guilty expression that suggested she had something important to confess. Beth was 67 years old, recently widowed after 43 years of marriage, and had always been what people politely called observant. Others might have used less charitable terms like nosy or gossipy, but I preferred to think of her as thorough in her attention to neighborhood activities. "I need to tell you something about that night," she said, settling herself at my kitchen table, "about when you found Jesse and the baby in the snow." We sat across from each other while the casserole cooled between us, neither of us particularly interested in food. Beth was wrestling with whatever she needed to say, and I was trying to be patient while every instinct I had was screaming that time was a factor we didn't have much of. "I saw it happen," she finally said. "Not just you finding them outside. I saw him put them out there." I kept my voice as neutral and encouraging as possible. "Tell me exactly what you saw." It was around 11 o'clock. I was having trouble sleeping. I do that a lot since Harold passed, so I was reading in my front room with the lights off. I like to watch the snow when it's falling heavy like that. She paused to gather her thoughts, and I waited. I heard shouting coming from their house. Not just loud conversation, but real shouting. Angry voices. Then I saw the front door open and K.O. pushed Jesse outside. She was carrying Emma, trying to talk to him, asking him to let them back in, but he just slammed the door and turned off the porch light. How long did this go on? 26 minutes. I kept looking at my clock, thinking surely he'd let them back in, but he never did. He just left them there. "Did you consider calling the police?" Her face flushed with shame. "I should have. I know I should have. But the Morrisons, they have so much influence in this town, and I'm just an old woman who people think talks too much about other people's business." And she reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital camera that looked like it had been expensive when she'd bought it several years ago. But I did record some of it. The video was 8 minutes and 37 seconds long, shot through her front window from about 60 feet away. The quality was surprisingly good, especially considering it had been taken at night through falling snow by a 70-year-old woman with arthritis. It showed everything she'd described: K.O. forcibly removing his wife and child from their home, Jesse pleading with him through the closed door, him closing the curtains and turning off the lights while they remained outside in sub-zero weather. But there was something else in the video that I'd completely missed on the night in question. Something that changed the entire context of what had happened. "Beth?" I said, pausing the playback and pointing to the screen. "What is Jessie holding in her left hand?" She leaned forward to look more closely. "It looks like papers of some kind, like maybe documents or letters. Documents that K.O. had clearly wanted back, badly enough to lock his family outside in potentially fatal weather conditions, rather than allow Jessie to keep possession of them. There's something else you need to know," Beth said quietly, "about why I waited so long to come forward with this information." My blood went cold. What happened? Someone came to visit me 2 days after that night. A man in an expensive suit who said he represented the Morrison family's interests. He wanted to know if I'd witnessed any unusual activity in the neighborhood recently. "What did you tell him?" I told him I hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary, but grand, he offered me $5,000 for my discretion regarding any family disputes I might have observed. "Did you take the money?" I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, but before he left, he made sure to mention that it would be a terrible shame if something happened to my little house. Said electrical fires are so unpredictable in houses this old, especially during winter when people use space heaters and extension cords. Someone with enough resources to hire well-dressed intimidation specialists was taking our investigation very seriously. That suggested the stakes were much higher than a simple domestic violence case. "Beth, I need to ask you a favor. Are you willing to testify about what you saw?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "That little girl," she finally said. Emma, she's just a baby. If something happens to her because I was too scared to speak up, we'll make sure you're protected. But I need that video, and I need your statement on the record." She nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" Friday morning, while Martha was preparing legal documents based on Beth's testimony and video evidence, I made a phone call that changed everything we thought we knew about K.O. Morrison's motivations. "Michigan Mutual Insurance Company, Claims Department, this is Jennifer speaking. I need to inquire about a life insurance policy. The policyholder is Jessica Morrison. Married name, maiden name, Jessica Rapids. I'll need to verify your relationship to the policyholder. I'm her father. She asked me to help her understand some insurance documents." There was a pause while Jennifer accessed her computer system. "I show a policy issued 3 weeks ago. $500,000 term life policy with Kenneth Morrison listed as the sole beneficiary. $500,000. Applied for and approved on November 8th, the same day that Jesse's pattern of household accidents had become noticeably more frequent." I thanked Jennifer and hung up, then immediately called Martha. "Emergency meeting right now." "What emergency are we talking about?" "Life and death emergency, literally." Martha's office at 10 o'clock on a Friday morning felt like a war room. We'd spread documents across every available surface: medical records, financial statements, surveillance photographs, insurance paperwork, and Beth's video evidence. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more disturbing than anything I'd encountered during 2 decades of military service. "The timeline is textbook," Martha said, studying the insurance application date. "Large policy purchased immediately after marriage, followed by escalating pattern of accidents designed to establish a medical history of clumsiness and injury-prone behavior." "What about Amanda Peterson?" "That's where this gets really interesting." Martha pulled out a file folder that was thicker than I'd expected. "I did some deeper research on Miss Peterson. Amanda Peterson is Tony Castellano's sister." The pieces clicked together like a weapon being field stripped and reassembled. "She's not Kaio's girlfriend. She's collateral." "Exactly. Tony is holding Amanda as insurance against Kaio's gambling debts. But Amanda's not just being held. She's being abused as a way to increase pressure on Kaio to pay what he owes." I studied the photographs I'd taken of Amanda Peterson, focusing on the bruising around her neck that had been visible above her sweater collar. "How much does Kaio owe?" "Based on what you observed at the gambling operation and factoring in typical interest rates for illegal lending, probably somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Friday deadline, no extensions, full payment or permanent consequences." Today was Friday. "Martha, we need to get Jesse and Emma into protective custody, right now." "Based on what? We have evidence of domestic violence and financial fraud, but we don't have direct evidence of a murder plot. We have a man who owes dangerous people more money than he can possibly repay through legal means. A life insurance policy that would solve all his problems if his wife died in an accident, and a pattern of escalating violence that's building toward something. It's all circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence convicts people every day, and right now I'm more worried about keeping my daughter alive than I am about winning in court." Martha was already reaching for her phone. "I'll call Judge Hendricks and request an emergency hearing. How fast can you get Jesse and Emma to a safe location?" "They're already there. They've been staying with me since this started." "Good. Keep them there until we can get legal protection in place." But as I was leaving Martha's office, I had the uncomfortable feeling that legal protection might not be enough if Kaio Morrison was as desperate as I thought he was. And if Tony Castellano was as dangerous as his reputation suggested. Judge Patricia Hendricks had 22 years on the bench, and a reputation for not suffering fools, time wasters, or attorneys who came to her courtroom unprepared. She'd agreed to hear our emergency motion for a protective order, but she'd made it clear that we'd better have evidence to justify disrupting her Friday afternoon schedule. The Morrison family arrived with their own legal team, 2 attorneys from one of Grand Rapids' most prestigious law firms, both wearing suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and both radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having lost a case they cared about winning. Ko sat between his lawyers, looking like the picture of wounded innocence, while Vincent Morrison Sr. occupied the front row behind them with the bearing of a man who was used to having his problems solved by writing checks. Your Honor, the lead Morrison attorney began, we're dealing with the unfortunate delusions of a grieving man who lost his wife 3 years ago and has been unable to accept that his daughter is happily married to a respected member of this community. I watched Ko during his attorney's opening statement. He seemed calm, almost relaxed, but his eyes kept moving to the courtroom clock. Whatever deadline he was operating under, it was approaching fast. Martha presented our evidence methodically and professionally. Medical records documenting a pattern of injuries, financial records showing systematic theft from Jesse's accounts, surveillance evidence of Ko's meetings with known criminals, and the insurance policy that provided clear motive for murder. When she played Beth's video, the courtroom fell completely silent. 8.5 minutes of Kenneth Morrison forcibly ejecting his wife and infant daughter from their home in sub-zero weather, then ignoring their pleas to be readmitted, while he continued his solitary dinner. The video was devastating. Even Ko's expensive attorneys looked uncomfortable as they watched their client's behavior displayed on the courtroom's video screen. Furthermore, Your Honor, Martha continued, we have evidence that Mr. Morrison is involved with organized crime figures who engage in illegal gambling operations, and that he currently owes substantial sums to individuals who are known to use violence to collect debts. The Morrison attorneys objected vigorously, but Judge Hendricks overruled them. She wanted to see all the evidence before making her decision. When Martha presented the life insurance policy documentation, something shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. $500,000 purchased 3 weeks ago, with escalating accidents beginning immediately afterward. Even people who weren't lawyers could see the implications. Judge Hendricks studied the documents for several minutes before speaking. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Did you purchase a life insurance policy on your wife without her knowledge? Ko's lead attorney started to object, but Judge Hendricks cut him off. I asked Mr. Morrison, not his attorney. Ko stood slowly. Your Honor, the insurance policy was a responsible financial decision designed to protect my family in case of tragedy. Did your wife know about it? A pause that lasted long enough to be damaging. I was planning to discuss it with her. Judge Hendricks made her decision in less than 5 minutes. Immediate protective order, removing Ko from the family home, asset freeze, preventing him from accessing joint financial accounts, supervised visitation only for any contact with his daughter, and referral to the prosecutor's office for investigation of potential criminal charges. But as we were leaving the courthouse, I noticed something that worried me more than anything that had happened during the hearing. Ko Morrison wasn't looking defeated or angry. He was looking desperate, and desperate men with nothing left to lose do desperate things. Friday evening at 7:23 p.m., my phone rang. Detective Ray Murphy's name appeared on the caller ID. Grand, you need to know that things are about to get very interesting very fast. What's happening? FBI has been running a long-term investigation into Tony Castellano's organization as part of a multi-state racketeering case. The information you provided about the gambling operation and money laundering gave them the missing pieces they needed to move forward. They're making arrests as we speak. 5 locations simultaneously: the gambling warehouse, Eastwood Automotive, Tony's house, and 2 safe houses where they've been holding people who couldn't pay their debts. I walked to my front window and looked out toward the warehouse district. Even from 3 miles away, I could see the glow of flashing emergency lights reflecting off the low clouds that had moved in during the afternoon. How many people are they arresting? Tony Castellano, 6 associates, and about 20 customers who were at the gambling operation when the raid started. They seized over $2 million in cash, illegal gaming equipment, and enough financial records to keep federal prosecutors busy for the next several years. What about Ko? That's the interesting part. He was at the warehouse when the raid began. Not gambling this time, but meeting with Tony about what the FBI is calling alternative payment arrangements. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What kind of alternative arrangements? They recorded him offering to make Tony a partner in his wife's life insurance policy in exchange for debt forgiveness and release of Amanda Peterson. Conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, racketeering, and probably half a dozen other federal charges that would ensure K.O. Morrison spent the rest of his productive adult life in federal prison. Is Amanda Peterson safe? She's in federal protective custody. Turns out she's been trying to get away from her brother's organization for 2 years, but they've been using threats against her elderly parents to keep her compliant. I sat down heavily in my living room chair, feeling the accumulated stress and tension of the past 2 weeks finally beginning to drain away. So, it's over. The criminal part is over. The legal aftermath is going to take months to sort out, but the immediate danger is finished. After I hung up, I walked upstairs to check on Jesse and Emma. They were both sleeping in my guest room, finally looking peaceful for the first time since this whole nightmare had started. Emma was curled up against her mother's side, both of them breathing the deep, regular rhythms of people who felt safe enough to truly rest. Saturday morning brought a different kind of phone call. Vincent Morrison Sr. calling personally to request a meeting. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where we could have a private conversation without the emotional weight of family homes or legal offices. Vincent looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week, and I suppose he had good reason. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble, and more than that, I owe you gratitude. But for what? For stopping my son before he did something that would have destroyed more lives than it already has. For protecting Jesse and Emma when I was too blind to see they needed protection. He pulled out a legal document and slid it across the table. This is a financial settlement covering all the money K.O. stole from Jesse's accounts, plus damages for the trauma he caused. It's also a formal apology from the Morrison family and a commitment to cooperate fully with any ongoing legal proceedings. I studied the document. It was more money than Jessie would need to rebuild her life, plus enough to ensure Emma's college education would be fully funded. Why? I asked. Because it's the right thing to do, and because I should have seen what kind of man my son was becoming before he put innocent people at risk. By Saturday afternoon, word of the FBI raid and subsequent arrests had spread throughout Grand Rapids. Suddenly, the same community that had turned cold shoulders to me a week earlier was treating me like someone who'd done something heroic. Bob from next door showed up with a 6-pack of beer and a sincere apology. I should have trusted your judgment, Grand. The Morrisons had all of us fooled about what kind of people they really were. My supervisor at the Ford plant called personally. Take all the time you need to get your family situation sorted out. When you're ready to come back, you've got the full support of management and your union. Even strangers stopped me at the grocery store to shake my hand and thank me for standing up for what's right when it would have been easier to look the other way. The truth has a way of changing people's perspectives. The same community that had questioned my judgment a week ago was now recognizing that sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the right thing to do. 6 weeks later, Jesse and Emma were still living in my house, but the arrangement had evolved from emergency shelter to something that felt more like family healing. Jesse was seeing a therapist twice a week and attending a support group for survivors of domestic violence. Some days were harder than others, but every day represented progress toward reclaiming her life. Emma was thriving in ways that broke my heart and filled it at the same time. She'd started walking confidently around my house, chattering in the mixed language of 18-month-olds, and showing the kind of fearless curiosity that comes from feeling completely safe in your environment. Her favorite word was grandpa, followed closely by cookie, no, and more. I should have listened to you sooner, Jesse told me one evening as we watched Emma play with blocks on the living room floor, building towers just high enough to knock down with delighted squeals. You weren't supposed to have to listen to me about this, I replied. You were supposed to marry someone who would never give you a reason to need protection from him. The house felt alive again in a way it hadn't since Sarah's death, 3 years earlier. Emma's laughter echoed through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. The smell of home-cooked family dinners replaced the stale air of a man living alone with his memories. Even the morning light seemed brighter as it streamed through windows that now framed hope instead of loneliness. Jessie was slowly rebuilding the confidence and independence that had been systematically destroyed during her marriage. She'd started working part-time as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit organization, using skills that Ko had told her she wasn't smart enough to use professionally. She was making her own financial decisions, choosing her own friends, and rediscovering interests that she'd been discouraged from pursuing. I want to go back to school, she told me one Sunday morning over breakfast. Finish my accounting degree, maybe eventually start my own practice. What's stopping you? Nothing, I guess. For the first time in 2 years, absolutely nothing is stopping me. Amanda Peterson sent me a letter through the federal prosecutor's office before she entered the witness protection program. Her new identity and location would remain classified, but she'd wanted to express her gratitude to the man who'd cared enough about strangers to investigate what was happening to them. Thank you for paying attention when no one else would, she wrote. Thank you for caring about people you'd never met and had no obligation to help. If more people were willing to get involved the way you did, fewer people would have to suffer the way I suffered. The truth is, I almost didn't get involved. I almost decided that what happened between a husband and wife was none of my business, even when that husband was married to my daughter. I almost chose the easier path of assuming that family problems should stay within families, that good people don't end up in genuinely dangerous situations, and that someone else would step in if intervention was really necessary. But sometimes silence isn't golden. Sometimes speaking up is the only thing that saves the people you love. If you're watching this story and you recognize warning signs in your own life or the life of someone you care about, financial control, isolation from family and friends, escalating accidents, threats against loved ones, please trust your instincts. Document everything you can. Reach out for professional help. Contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, where trained counselors are available 24 hours a day to provide guidance and support. And if you're someone whose family member seems to be in trouble, don't wait for permission to care. Don't wait for proof that would hold up in court. Don't wait until you're standing in sub-zero weather, watching your granddaughter cry from cold while her father eats dinner inside a warm house. Pay attention. Ask difficult questions. Take action when action is necessary. Because families aren't just about sharing DNA. They're about showing up for each other when showing up matters most. They're about protecting the people who can't protect themselves. They're about choosing love over convenience, courage over comfort, and action over apathy. 6 months later, Emma took her first confident steps across my living room, walking from the couch to my outstretched arms with the fearless determination of someone who knows she'll be caught if she falls. That's the kind of family I want her to grow up in. The kind of family where people catch each other when they fall instead of pushing each other down. The kind of family where no one gets left outside in the cold.